My name is Lauren Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. The day my grandfather's will was read aloud, in a mahogany-paneled room, full of people who had never once visited him, in the last 2 years of his life, my mother laughed. Not a polite, restrained laugh. A full, open-mouthed laugh that bounced off the crown molding and landed on every single face in that room. The estate attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Garrison, paused mid-sentence and looked at her over the rim of his glasses. She pressed her fingers to her lips, composed herself, and said, "I'm sorry." "It's just so perfectly, Walter." My father, seated beside her with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set in that particular way that always meant satisfaction, allowed himself a slow, close-lipped smile. My sister Brielle, 29 years old, already leaning forward in her chair with her eyes on the numbers, turned and looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face my entire life. Pity mixed with pleasure. The kind of look someone gives you when they are not me-sized, you got the short end of something. The item bequeathed to me, Lauren Ann Whitfield, the oldest grandchild, had just been read aloud by Mr. Garrison in his careful, neutral voice. One antique key, brass, housed in a small cedar box. No further description, no address, no explanation. What they didn't know was that I had already been to the bank. I already knew what that key opened. I had already spoken with the manager on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the will was read. While my parents were hosting a dinner party in their 4-bedroom home in Scottsdale, and my sister was posting photos of her new car on social media. I had already sat in a private room on the 2nd floor of First Continental Trust and looked at what my grandfather had spent 40 years quietly building for me. This is that story. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching or listening to this right now? What city, what country, what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below, because I genuinely love knowing where these stories travel. And if you connect with stories about women who were written off, overlooked, handed crumbs by the very people who were supposed to protect them, and who eventually let the truth do all the talking, please subscribe and leave a like. You belong here. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My grandfather, Walter Emmett Hale, was born in a small town in central Illinois in 1941. He was the son of a hardware store owner and a school teacher, which meant he grew up understanding 2 things very clearly: the value of $1 and the value of showing up. He never went to college. He went into the Army at 18, came back at 21 with a disciplined mind and a deep distrust of anyone who talked more than they worked. He started a small mechanical parts distribution business out of a rented garage in Peoria when he was 24 years old. By the time he was 40, Hale Industrial Supply had contracts with 3 mid-sized manufacturers across Illinois and Indiana. By the time he was 60, he had quietly sold the business for a number he never told anyone, moved to a modest ranch home in Tucson, and begun investing with the kind of patient, unremarkable consistency that does not make headlines but absolutely does make fortunes. My grandmother, Edna Hale, passed away when I was 11. She was the soft counterpart to his practicality. She baked on Sundays and kept a garden, and read aloud to me from a book of Greek myths that she kept on the nightstand in the guest room. When she died, something in my grandfather shifted slightly, the way a house settles after a storm. He became quieter, more still, but he never stopped showing up. He showed up for my school recitals when my parents forgot. He showed up at my college graduation with a bouquet of yellow roses and a card that said, "First one across the line. I always knew it would be you." He drove 3 hours each way to attend my graduate school thesis defense and sat in the back row in a blazer and a bolo tie, nodding slowly at everything I said. My parents, on the other hand, were not bad people in the dramatic way. They were something more insidious, selectively present. Dennis Whitfield, my father, was 58 years old and the regional manager for a commercial insurance brokerage. He was competent, well-dressed, and utterly absorbed in the cultivation of his own image. He coached my sister's soccer team but never attended a single one of my debate tournaments. He renovated the family room 3 times in 15 years, but declined to co-sign my student loans because, as he explained to me at 19 years old over the dinner table, "You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, Lauren." My sister Brielle, who was 16 at the time and not yet applying to college, watched him say this and said nothing. My mother, Renata Whitfield, was 55, a real estate agent with a talent for staging other people's lives to look better than they were. She was warm and social in public. At home, she operated on a quiet system of favoritism that she had never once acknowledged directly. Brielle had been the chosen one since the beginning. I was never able to identify a single moment that established this hierarchy. It simply existed the way gravity exists, wordlessly and absolutely. Two specific examples stand out, though there were dozens. When I was 22 and had just started my first job as a junior financial analyst, my car died on the highway outside Phoenix on a Tuesday night in January. I called my father first. He did not answer. I called my mother. She answered, listened, and said, "Honey, your father and I are at the Miller's dinner. Can you call roadside assistance?" I waited 2 hours on the shoulder of the highway alone in the dark. When I finally got home at midnight, there were no missed calls. 6 months later, Brielle called my parents from a mall parking lot because her car had a flat tire. My father left a client lunch to drive 40 minutes and change it himself. My mother brought her Starbucks. I found out from Brielle 2 weeks after the fact, mentioned casually over the phone, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. The second example is smaller and somehow more telling. 3 years ago, I was promoted to senior financial analyst at the firm where I worked. I called my parents. My mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then immediately pivoted to telling me about Brielle's new apartment. My father said, "Good. Now don't let them underpay you." I sent a follow-up text with the details of the promotion and my new title. My mother replied with a thumbs-up emoji. At Christmas that year, when extended family gathered around my parents' dining room table, my father gave a toast and mentioned, unprompted, that Brielle had just gotten a small raise at her marketing job. My promotion was not mentioned. I sat across the table and counted the pine cones in the centerpiece. There were 11. My grandfather saw all of this. He did not say much about it directly. That was not his way, but he watched. He had the specific, quiet attentiveness of a man who had spent decades evaluating people for reliability and character, and he had clearly been watching my family for a long time. The last full year of his life, I drove to Tucson every other month to sit with him. He was 81, still sharp, still funny, but slowing. His hips bothered him. He watched old westerns in the evenings and drank 1 bourbon before bed. We would sit on his back porch after dinner, and he would ask me questions about my work, real questions, the kind that required actual answers. He wanted to understand what I did. He wanted to know how I thought. My parents visited him twice in the last 18 months of his life, both times because there was a holiday as a reason. Brielle visited once, took a photo of herself in his kitchen, posted it with the caption "Grandpa Time," and did not return. In October of the year before he passed, my grandfather handed me an envelope during one of my visits. He was sitting in his recliner with the television off for once, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. "Don't open that now," he said. "Put it somewhere safe and open it when I'm gone." I asked him if he was feeling all right. He smiled at me, the particular smile he had that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and said, "I'm better than all right. I've been taking care of business." I held the envelope on the drive home with one hand on the wheel and one hand resting on it in the passenger seat, as though it might shift if I did not keep contact with it. He passed away the following March, quietly in his own home, the way he had always said he wanted. I flew to Tucson the morning after the call. My parents arrived that evening. Brielle arrived the day after, direct from a girls' weekend in Sedona, with her nails freshly done and a large iced coffee in her hand. I stayed in his house for 4 days, going through things with the sort of deliberate care he would have appreciated. I found his finances organized in labeled binders. I found his will in a sealed envelope in the top drawer of his desk with a note on the outside that said, "For Mr. Garrison only." I found his Christmas card list, which included 37 names, and I recognized that I was the only family member on it who had a separate notation beside my name. It simply said, "Call in March," and then I found the envelope he had given me in October. I had placed it in the inside pocket of a blazer I rarely wore, and it was still there when I packed for the trip, which felt like exactly the kind of safekeeping he had intended. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the room where Grandma Edna used to read to me from Greek myths, and I opened it. Inside was a single brass key and a handwritten letter on his personal stationery, the kind with the small hawk embossed in the corner, which had been his business logo once, and which he kept using simply because he liked it. The letter said this: "I am going to read it to you exactly. Lauren, if you're reading this, I've gone ahead. First, don't let your mother reorganize my kitchen. She'll want to. Don't let her. Second, and more importantly, the key in this envelope belongs to a private vault at First Continental Trust on East Speedway Boulevard. The account number is on the back of this letter. You are the sole named beneficiary of the Howard Emmett Hale Family Trust. Mr. Garrison knows about the will, but not about the trust. The trust was structured separately and has never been part of the estate. Margaret at the bank knows you're coming. Call her on a Tuesday before 11 in the morning. She prefers that. There are things in that vault I want you to see with your own eyes before anyone else does. The trust contains everything I actually built. The will contains what I decided everyone else deserved to know about. There is a difference. You were always the one who showed up, Lauren. I don't forget things like that. Take care of yourself. Don't let them dim you. All my love, Grandpa Walter." I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. Then I took out my phone, and I set a reminder for the following Tuesday at 9:45 in the morning. I want to stop here for just a moment, because if you are still watching, you are the person I am talking to. You are the one who has probably been the Lauren in some version of this story, the one who showed up, the one who did the work, the one whose name got left out of the toast. Drop a comment right now. Tell me your story, even just one line, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because this channel exists specifically for people like us. The Tuesday appointment. I drove to First Continental Trust on East Speedway Boulevard at 9:52 in the morning. The building was beige and unassuming, the kind of place that does not advertise what it holds. I gave my name at the front desk and asked for Margaret. Margaret Chen turned out to be 53, composed, with close-cut silver hair and reading glasses on a chain that reminded me, with a pull in my chest, of my grandmother. She shook my hand with both of hers. "I've been expecting you," she said. "Your grandfather spoke about you often." She led me to a private room on the second floor, with a combination lock on the interior door and a small table with 2 chairs. She placed 2 documents in front of me. The first was a summary of the Howard Emmett Hale Family Trust. The second was an asset schedule. I read the summary. The trust had been established and funded 17 years earlier. The sole named beneficiary was Lauren Ann Whitfield. The trustee was Margaret Chen herself at my grandfather's specific written request. Then I looked at the asset schedule. I read the first line. I read it again. I set the paper down and looked at Margaret. She watched me with the calm of someone who had been present for this moment before and understood its weight. "He never told anyone," I said. "No," she said. "He was very deliberate about that. How long have you known?" 17 years, she said. "He came in on a Wednesday in early April the year he sold the business. He had a cashier's check and a folder of instructions, and he sat in that chair exactly where you're sitting now, and he told me what he wanted to do and why." The asset schedule listed the vault. Contents. The trust held the proceeds from the business sale, reinvested over 17 years through a conservative but consistent portfolio strategy. It held 3 commercial real estate properties in Illinois, all paid off, generating combined rental income of approximately $22,000 per month. It held a diversified investment account. It held the contents of a physical vault, deeds, original certificates, documented valuations, and 41 years of meticulous financial records, kept in the same labeled binder format I had found in his desk at home. The total documented value of the trust assets as of the most recent quarterly statement was $47,312,000. I did not cry. I did not make a sound. I sat in that chair and breathed slowly and let the number exist in the room with me. Then I asked Margaret 2 questions. The first, was this legally clean? She confirmed it was. Established before his death, funded entirely with his own assets, structured as an irrevocable trust with me as sole beneficiary. My father's name appeared nowhere. My mother's name appeared nowhere. Brielle's name appeared nowhere. The second question, did Mr. Garrison know? She confirmed he did not. The will and the trust were entirely separate instruments. I thanked her. I picked up the key which she had placed in a small cedar box, the same cedar I would later receive publicly during the will reading. I drove home. I did not call my parents. I did not call Brielle. I made a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and began making a list. Over the following 3 weeks, I did 6 things. I retained a trust and estate attorney named Daniel Cho, who came recommended by a colleague and who wore a watch that he wound by hand every morning, which told me something about his relationship with precision. We met twice for 2 hours each time, and he reviewed every document. His conclusion was unambiguous. The trust was airtight, structured and executed flawlessly, and entirely outside the scope of the estate. Second, I notified Margaret officially, in writing, that I was accepting the trust and would be working with Daniel Cho as my attorney. Third, I requested a formal written confirmation from First Continental Trust of the trust's existence, its structure, its asset value, and my status as sole beneficiary. The confirmation arrived in a FedEx envelope on a Thursday afternoon. I placed it in a fireproof box I bought the same day. Fourth, I arranged for a property management firm to continue overseeing the 3 commercial properties in Illinois without interruption. Fifth, I did not tell a single person, not my closest friend, not my colleague.
No one.
Sixth, I showed up to the will reading. The will reading was held on a Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Mr. Garrison's office, which was located in a low building near the university, with the kind of carpet that had absorbed 40 years of heavy conversations. Seated in the room, my parents, my sister Brielle and her boyfriend Marcus, my Aunt Patricia, who was my grandfather's younger sister, her husband Ronald, and 2 cousins I had not seen in years. Mr. Garrison sat behind the desk with the kind of neutral expression that professional discretion produces over a lifetime. The will was methodical. My grandfather left his house in Tucson to be sold, with proceeds split equally among his children, which in practice meant my mother and Aunt Patricia. He left his car to my father, which my father received with a nod that tried to look humble. He left Brielle a jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother and a set of crystal stemware. He left Aunt Patricia's children various household items and a donation in their names to a literacy foundation he had supported for years. Each bequest was read in order. My name had not yet appeared when we reached approximately 2/3 through the document. Then Mr. Garrison said, clearly and without inflection, "To my granddaughter Lauren Ann Whitfield, I leave the contents of the cedar box currently in my desk, to be opened in private at her discretion." The box contains 1 antique brass key. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then my mother laughed, my father smiled. Brielle looked at me. I looked at the table. I had prepared for this moment, but preparation and experience are different things, and there was still a cold, specific feeling of exposure that moved through me, an old reflex of shame activated by a familiar stimulus. I breathed through it. I let my face be still. I did not say a word. Brielle leaned over and touched my arm in the way she had always touched me when she wanted to perform sympathy in public. "That's," she whispered, "vintage Grandpa." My father did not look at me. He was already talking to Ronald in a low voice about the real estate implications of the house sale. My mother caught my eye from across the table and tilted her head slightly in that particular gesture that I had always understood to mean, "Well, what did you expect, Mr.?" Garrison presented me with the cedar box. I accepted it with both hands. I set it in my lap. I kept my face exactly where I had put it. We gathered in the parking lot afterward, in the way that people gather after official proceedings when no one knows quite how to transition back into ordinary conversation. My father was on his phone. My mother was speaking with Aunt Patricia in the low, warm tones of shared inheritance. Brielle stood beside me. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You seem quiet." "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." She nodded and then said, without apparent awareness of how it landed, I think Grandpa always loved you. It's just that you two were so different. He was such a traditional businessman, and you're so, She trailed off. I looked at her. "No," I said, "I don't know." She found somewhere else to be. My parents took me to dinner that evening at a restaurant near their house. It was my father's choice, a steakhouse where the menus had no prices, the kind of place where men take their families to perform generosity. My mother ordered a second glass of wine and told a story about a property she had just listed. My father talked about a client trip to Denver. Brielle and Marcus discussed a vacation they were planning. I ate my dinner and listened and spoke when spoken to, and gave nothing away. At one point my father looked across the table at me with an expression that was almost kind. "Your grandfather always had a soft spot for you," he said. The key thing was probably sentimental. "Something from the hardware store days, maybe?" "Maybe," I said. "Has your sister told you about her new account at work?" my mother said, pivoting to Brielle with the smooth ease of someone who had been redirecting attention her entire life. I watched Brielle receive the spotlight, and I sat in my place at the table, and I thought about the letter in my fireproof box, and the cedar box on my kitchen counter, and the $47,312,000 sitting quietly in a trust with my name on it, and I cut my steak and chewed and said nothing at all. The first call came 6 days after the will reading. My mother. Her voice was warm and exploratory, the register she used when she wanted information but did not want to ask directly. "Have you figured out what the key opens?" she asked. "Still looking into it," I said. "It's probably something small, a lockbox or something. We thought maybe a safe deposit box?" "From one of his old accounts." "Could be," I said. "I'll let you know." The second call came 4 days later. My father this time. "Listen, I was thinking, if there's anything significant in that deposit box, we should probably talk to Mr. Garrison together, make sure everything's handled correctly." "Of course," I said. "I'll be in touch." The third call came from Brielle, who was less subtle than both of them combined. "Marcus thinks if it's a physical key it might be for something worth real money," she said. "Like vintage stuff or something. Have you Googled the key?" "I've looked into it," I said. The fourth call came from my mother again, 9 days after the will reading. "Honey, your father and I are just thinking about you. With the house going on the market and everything being divided up, we want to make sure you're not left out in the cold." Left out in the cold. The woman who had laughed in Mr. Garrison's office was now concerned about me being left out in the cold. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "I'll let you know what I find." I called Daniel Cho the following morning. I told him I was ready. He told me he would be in touch with Mr. Garrison's office. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday, 11 days later at 10 o'clock in the morning. Daniel chose a conference room at his own firm rather than Mr. Garrison's office, which was a deliberate choice. It was his terrain, structured to project authority and calm. He invited Mr. Garrison as a courtesy to provide clarity about the relationship between the will and the trust. He invited Margaret Chen, who attended in person with a folder of documents. And at my request, we extended an invitation to my parents, my sister, and Aunt Patricia. I did not tell them what the meeting was about. My father's assistant confirmed on his behalf. My mother confirmed herself within 4 minutes of receiving the call. Brielle confirmed the same day. Aunt Patricia sent a handwritten note saying she would attend. I arrived at Daniel Cho's office at 9:23 in the morning. I wore a charcoal gray blazer over a white blouse and the only piece of jewelry my grandfather had ever given me directly. A simple gold bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother, and which he had presented to me quietly, without ceremony, on my 30th birthday. Margaret was already there. We shook hands and she smiled with the particular warmth of someone who has been keeping a secret for a long time, and is finally allowed to set it down. My family arrived between 9:55 and 10:04. My parents together, my father in the blazer he wore to business meetings, my mother in the jacket she considered authoritative. Brielle and Marcus behind them, Aunt Patricia and Ronald last, slightly breathless from the elevator. They arranged themselves around the conference table, with the slight competitive angling of people who believe they are about to receive information that may affect their interests. I sat across from my parents. Daniel sat to my right. Margaret sat beside Daniel. Mr. Garrison sat at the far end. My father looked around the room with the calibrated gaze of a man who reads rooms professionally. His eyes moved from Daniel to Margaret to me. Something in his expression shifted slightly, a recalibration, like a compass adjusting to a new north. My mother arranged her handbag on the table in front of her. Brielle whispered something to Marcus. I folded my hands and waited. Daniel opened the meeting. His voice was even and unhurried in the way of someone who has delivered significant information before, and understands that the delivery itself is part of the information. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Lauren has asked me to facilitate a clarification meeting regarding the estate of Walter Emmett Hale. Garrison is here in his capacity as a state attorney to confirm the separation between what I'm about to describe and the formal will you've already reviewed. Margaret Chen from First Continental Trust is here as trustee." My father's jaw moved. My mother set her hands on the table. 17 years ago, Daniel continued, Walter Hale established an irrevocable private family trust with First Continental Trust. The trust was funded entirely with assets from the sale of his business and structured entirely independently of his estate. It was therefore not subject to probate and does not appear in the will Mr. Garrison read last month. He paused. The room was completely silent. Brielle had stopped moving. "The trust names one sole beneficiary," Daniel said. "Lauren Ann Whitfield." He slid a copy of the trust summary to the center of the table. My father reached for it. My mother reached for it at the same moment. Their hands landed on it simultaneously. My father pulled it toward himself and began reading. I watched his face. He read the first page. He turned to the second. Then he reached the asset summary. His hand stopped moving. He stared at the page for a long time. My mother leaned over to read it. I watched her face do something I had never seen it do before. The self-assurance, the practiced composure, the specific quality of expression she used for every social performance, it went somewhere. Underneath it was something raw and unscripted. My father set the page down on the table very carefully, as though it were something that could be damaged by force. He looked at me. "How long have you known?" he asked. His voice was measured, but the steadiness cost him something. "Since October," I said. He gave me the key and the letter himself. Silence. Margaret spoke, gently and with complete authority. "Walter Hale trusted Lauren with this information in advance, because he trusted her judgment. The trust is structured to transfer to her management as of his passing, which has occurred. The vault contents, the investment portfolio, and the property deeds are now in Lauren's custody under the trust terms." My mother turned to Mr. Garrison. "Did you know about this?" "I did not," he said. "The trust was entirely separate." "Is it challengeable?" my father asked, directing the question at Daniel. "On what grounds?" Daniel replied. It was not rhetorical. My father had no answer. "He built this over 17 years, Daniel said. "It is properly established, properly funded, and properly documented. There is no legal basis for a challenge." Brielle was very still. Marcus had his hand over his mouth. Aunt Patricia was looking at me with an expression that was hard to read. Not anger, not exactly. More like a long, slow recognition settling into place. My mother found her voice first. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that I think she genuinely believed was maternal concern, but which arrived 17 years too late. "Lauren," she said. "Why didn't you tell us?" "He asked me not to," I said. This was true. "Before the will reading?" "Yes." "You knew the entire time we were sitting in that room and you didn't say anything?" "I knew the entire time I drove 3 hours to Tucson twice a month for the last year of his," I said, and my voice was steady and quiet, "that you had visited him twice." No one spoke. "He saw everything," I said. "He always had." The weeks that followed were not triumphant in the way that the word triumph suggests. There was no celebration, there was no speech. There was only the slow, heavy work of consequence settling into its proper place. My father called me 3 days after the meeting. His voice was different. Something had gone out of it, the practiced authority, the tonal quality that had always communicated that he was the person in the room who set the terms. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He asked if I was going to help the family. I told him I intended to be fair, as my grandfather had been fair, and that fair was not the same as equal, and it had never been. He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I know I wasn't always." It was 4 words. It was not enough, and it was more than I had ever heard from him in 34 years. I accepted it without declaring it sufficient. My mother called 2 days later. Her call lasted 37 minutes and covered, in rough order, an apology that was partially obscured by justification, a reference to how hard she had worked, a pivot to Brielle's needs, and a return, near the end, to something that sounded more honest. "I didn't think you needed it," she said. "The attention. You always seemed so capable. That was the problem, I said. You mistook capability for not needing anything. She was quiet. I think you're right, she said. It was the first time in my life I heard her say those words to me and mean them without immediately following them with a redirection. I stayed on the phone with her until she was ready to hang up. Brielle texted rather than called, which was consistent with who she was. The text said, "I've been thinking. I don't think I was a good sister. I don't really know how to fix that." I read it 3 times. Then I wrote back, "Start with showing up when nothing is required of you." She did not respond immediately. She responded 6 days later with, "Can I come visit?" I said yes. Aunt Patricia wrote me a letter by hand, 3 pages, in the rounded, careful script of a woman who had been raised to take correspondence seriously. She told me that she had watched my grandfather make this decision over many years, that he had spoken to her once, briefly, about Lauren, and the way he had said my name had told her everything she needed to know about his intentions. She told me she was not surprised. She told me she was glad. I went back to Tucson in May. I sat in the back porch where he and I had spent so many evenings, and I looked at the garden that had grown a little wild since he had stopped tending it, and I thought about all of it. The key on the nightstand in my apartment, the letter with the hawk embossed in the corner, Margaret's face when she shook my hands with both of hers, my father's hand going still on the asset schedule, my mother's composure sliding away from underneath her, and I thought about what my grandfather had actually given me, which was not, at its center, the money. The money was real, and it was significant, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But what he had actually given me was something else entirely. He had given me documented proof that one person in my family had seen me clearly, consistently, over decades, and had made decisions accordingly. He had given me the record of a witness. He had given me, in a cedar box with a brass key, the confirmation that I had not been invisible, that I had not been misreading the room, that the girl who drove 3 hours twice a month and sat on the porch and answered real questions with real answers had been seen every single time. I think about that for anyone watching this who is in the thick of a family story like this one, who is still in the part where you are the invisible one, where your name is left out of the toast and your seat is at the far end of the table. The records are being kept, maybe not by a grandfather with labeled binders, maybe by your own memory, maybe by the people who show up for you quietly when no one is performing. But the records are being kept, and the truth has a way of surfacing on its own timeline, which is never the timeline we would choose and almost always the right one. My grandfather's gift was not a surprise in the dramatic sense. It was not a reversal of fortune. It was a continuity. It was the logical outcome of decades of consistency, his and mine. He had been watching for 40 years. I had been showing up. The math was simple. He was just the one who showed it. I returned home from Tucson with a small cactus from his garden wrapped carefully in newspaper in the back seat. It lives on my kitchen windowsill now next to the cedar box. Every morning when I make coffee, I look at both of them. The cactus is alive, the cedar box is open. The key is inside it, brass and ordinary and weightless. There are questions I cannot answer about what comes next with my family, whether the distance closes or whether it stays exactly as wide as it has always been, but now acknowledged. Whether my father and I find a language that works. Whether Brielle and I become something more than the memory of 2 girls who were treated differently in the same house. I don't know. What I know is that I am not the one who has to determine the pace of that. I have done the work I needed to do. I kept showing up. I kept the records. I answered the real questions. If there is someone in your life who has been treating your capability as a reason to withhold from you, who has been mistaking your stillness for indifference, who has been handing you the small bequests while preparing the real inheritance for someone else, I want to say this directly. Your grandfather is somewhere keeping track. Maybe it is a literal person with a cedar box and a brass key. Maybe it is something else entirely. But the ledger of who shows up is always being written by someone. Make sure you are on the right side of it. I'll ask you one question to close. If you could write a letter to the person in your family who never saw you clearly, and you knew they would finally, truly read it, what is the first sentence you would write? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If you watched all the way to the end, I want you to know that means something. These stories exist because someone needs to hear them, and every time you stay until the final word, you remind me why we tell them. You are not here by accident. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And come back tomorrow, because there is always another story, another woman, another moment of quiet, earned, unshakable truth waiting to be told. I'll be here. See you then.